Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. This webinar this afternoon is going to be focusing on sharing the findings from our commissioned research project, Applying the Child First Framework in Youth Justice Services, which was published last month. Crest Advisory was commissioned by us, the Youth Justice Board, to deepen its understanding of how the Child First Framework is being applied within youth justice services across England and Wales. So this piece of research emerged from our research prioritisation process in 2023 to 24, which involved consultation across government, academia and internal departments. Through this process, we identified a clear need to better understand and support how services are practically applying the Child First framework. And this closely aligns with our strategic goals as an organisation and the broader youth justice landscape. And we're really pleased to see this really important piece of research come to fruition. So just before I hand over to Crest, who will take you through the research and its findings, I just want to outline some housekeeping points. So this webinar will be recorded and published on YouTube. Cameras and microphones are disabled for attendees except from the speakers. There will be an opportunity to ask questions through the Q&A function on this webinar, and these will be answered at the end of the presentation. The recording, slides and any other relevant information will be shared via email later this month. So thank you very much. I will now hand over to Jessica Hull from Crest, who will talk you through today's agenda.
Thanks very much, Leah. And a huge welcome to everyone joining us today online. It's really good to see so many people, and we're really pleased to have the opportunity to present some of the key findings from our research to you today. So as Leah said, my name is Jess Hull. I'm a Senior Strategy and Insight Manager at Crest Advisory. I'm the co-author of this research, along with my colleagues at Crest, who I will introduce properly in a moment. So the purpose of today's session is to present to you some of the key findings and recommendations from Crest's research on the application of the Child First framework in youth justice services. We'll spend a little bit of time explaining our approach to the research and the background of the Child First framework, and then we can explore findings and recommendations from the work as well. At around 3 p.m, we'll wrap up the presentation and then we'll open the floor to questions. Before we get going, I just want to take a moment to acknowledge and say thank you to the people who have contributed to or supported us to deliver this research. So the YJB for their support to disseminate the research tools and engage services, all the practitioners who engaged in the work and shared their experience, with particular thanks to the two services who invited us to collaborate closely with them for deep dives. And another really important thanks to the children who engaged in this research and took the time to share their experience with us. Leah's already run through some of the key housekeeping bits to flag, so just to reiterate that the chat function is turned off, but we really encourage you to use the QA function at the top or bottom of your screen, depending on the format, to ask any questions that you have about the research, the findings or recommendations. Please do kind of send these throughout, and as Leah said, we will come to those in the Q&A session at the end and answer as many as possible. As Leah's mentioned, the session is being recorded, so for that reason, please just avoid sharing any personal or sensitive information. And finally, just to ask, please do be respectful when engaging and asking questions. It's really appreciated. So to properly introduce ourselves, Crest Advisory is an independent consultancy and think tank. We focus our research and advise on crime and justice. We have lots of experience in the youth justice space, including research on trauma-informed practice in the youth justice system, as well as youth violence and vulnerability. Alongside myself, today you'll hear from other members of the research team, including Fernanda Reynoso-Serna, who's the lead analyst for this research, and Kalyan De Roche, the project lead and head of strategy and policy at Crest. The final member of our team, analyst Danny Banks, is also joining us on the webinar today. So just to begin, I want to share an overview of the context and scope of the research and the approach that we took. So as Leah outlined, the YJB commissioned Crest in spring 2024 to conduct research to understand more about the barriers and enablers for youth justice services in applying the Child First framework. The YJB's vision is for a child first youth justice system, so one that sees children as children, treats them fairly and puts them at the heart of service provision. Despite the YJB leading many initiatives to support that vision, there does remain variation in the application of the Child First tenets across the system. So research was needed to better understand how the Child First framework is actually being applied across youth justice services, including how YJB materials are being utilised and some of the barriers and enablers to implementation. So our research aims to address this evidence gap, and the focus of our recommendations is on how the YJB can support youth justice services to implement the Child First framework. We took a mixed methods approach to the research across 3 distinct phases of work. So just to give you a sense of timelines here, the first phase of work was focused on understanding the existing evidence base and policy landscape behind the Child First framework. And to do this, we conducted an open source evidence review of research and literature. In the second phase of work, we looked to understand more about children and practitioners' perspectives on the application of the Child First framework across England and Wales. And to do this, we distributed 2 surveys to youth justice services across England and Wales. One was for children who are currently supported by youth justice services, and one was for practitioners who are working in youth justice services. The practitioners responding to that survey included frontline staff, as well as managers and seconded staff as well. So, for example, police officers or probation officers. We conducted descriptive analysis of that survey data to understand staff perspectives on how the Child First framework is applied, and to understand children's experience as well of the support and approach taken in their service. And then finally, in phase 3, we partnered with 2 youth justice services to do a deep dive on the application of the framework at their service and gather more in-depth insight and perspectives on some of the challenges to applying the framework, as well as being able to contextualize our survey findings. We took a combined inductive and deductive approach to focus groups and interview analysis here with practitioners to identify some of the key themes from that engagement. And then our findings from across the 3 phases of work were triangulated and brought together to achieve a comprehensive understanding of the challenges and enablers to applying the Child First framework in youth justice services. On this slide, I just wanted to pull out some of the ways that we were able to apply a robust and ethical approach to all our methods, including across the evidence review, sampling and recruitment. So in our evidence review, we explored grey and peer-reviewed literature, which included reviews of the YJB Child First Pathfinder projects, which pilot different aspects of the Child First framework. Insights from our evidence review guided the development of the surveys, as well as a qualitative engagement, which ensured that our research builds on the evidence base rather than duplicating it. We used non-random voluntary response sampling for both the children and the practitioners survey. And in line with our ethical framework, practitioners were provided with guidance to reduce survey bias, ensure accessibility of both surveys, particularly the one for children, obtain informed consent from children participating in the research, and assess skill and competency in line with that as well. Finally, when identifying services to partner with, we asked for expressions of interest from services across England and Wales, and then conducted follow-up calls with services that replied to the expression of interest to assess their confidence in applying the Child First framework, as well as their capacity to take part in the research. So we were looking to partner with services that had identified areas of challenge around the application of the Child First framework, so that our engagement could explore and unpick some of the reasons behind those challenges, and hold solution-focused conversations with services about what additional support might be needed from the YJB. The 2 partner services that we selected both felt confident in the implementation of the Child First framework, but they acknowledged some ongoing challenges at their service. Both services engaged were based in England, but one was from a rural and one was from an urban setting. On this slide, I just wanted to pull out one particular aspect of the engagement and research, which we found particularly interesting and important to push forward our approach. So as part of our deep dive engagement with services, we held interactive in-person workshops to explore some of the challenges and opportunities for applying the Child First framework. And just to give you an example, during the workshops, one of the activities practitioners took part in was based around a Venn diagram activity. And the purpose of this was to categorize statements related to the Child First framework, trauma-informed approaches, and restorative approaches as well. And the activity aimed to explore how practitioners understand and differentiate these approaches using statements drawn from different sources, including the YJB Guidance and Resource Hub. So you can see on the screen some examples of those statements included: promotes children's individual strengths and capacities, acknowledges the needs of the child, and involves the child in decision-making process to tailor the intervention. So what we did is we asked practitioners to place the statements where they felt they best fit across these different frameworks and approaches. But what's important is that the focus here was less on the correct placement of the statement. Rather, it was an exercise to help prompt honest reflection and discussion from practitioners around the overlaps between these frameworks and approaches, and consider how they might draw on the language or terminology associated with these approaches and frameworks in their casework, in their day-to-day work. And then explore aspects of these as a group, and consider as well areas where perhaps the approaches and frameworks didn't align well in their perspective. So this was an exercise that practitioners found helpful and interesting as a discussion prompt, and could even be replicated to support similar conversations at other services. It is important to note that the research wasn't without limitations, and just to highlight 2 key limitations from the work. So it's important to note that findings from the surveys can't be generalised. So while the surveys do provide valuable data and insight on the perspectives of children and practitioners, and we received 53 responses from children and 238 responses from practitioners, the results should still be interpreted with caution due to the limited sample size, and the findings are not nationally representative of England and Wales. Secondly, as I mentioned, the deep dives in phase 3 did only involve 2 youth justice services in England, so therefore the insight from that engagement in the deep dives is also not generalisable across England and Wales, but should be considered depth case studies. Right, before we get into the findings and recommendations in more detail, we just wanted to pause and pose a question to the room to gauge your current familiarity with the Child First framework in whatever capacity you are joining us today, whether that's as a frontline case holder, an academic, a manager in a service, or partner. So if tech has gone to plan, you should be able to answer this question as a poll in the chat. The question is simply, are you familiar with the Child First framework? And hopefully you should be able to see this now. One moment, we are just sorting out a technical challenge. John, might you be able to help us here? I can see polls is added to the chat, but I don't think we can access the chat at the moment. Okay. Well, we might have to answer that question in our own minds and just project the answer outwards. But in any case, the idea was to gauge people's current kind of level of awareness and understanding with the framework, because we appreciate that people are coming to the presentation today from all different backgrounds. And there it is, perfect. Thanks, John, for sorting that. Okay, if people could just take a moment to have a look at the poll question in the chat, and just let us know, how familiar are you with the Child First framework? So you can see answers starting to come in, that's great. Just leave it up for a few seconds more. Okay, brilliant. Some answers still trickling in, but can definitely see a trend here, which is over half, kind of the majority, are very familiar, and most are slightly familiar as well. So very few people haven't heard of it at all. And thank you very much to those people for attending today to learn more about the framework. But most people have a good familiarity, it looks like, of the Child First framework, which is really positive. And it actually echoes our research findings, as we'll explore a bit more in a moment. But it is really encouraging to see that broad awareness across people attending today. And I know we do have attendees joining from primarily youth justice, but also from partner services, kind of policing, health and courts as well. So this is really encouraging and positive to see. I think we can close the poll now, John. Thank you very much for that. So I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Fernanda now, who's going to take you through the background to our research. Thanks, Fernanda.
Thank you very much, Jess. As Jess just mentioned, I will briefly run us through the background of the Child First framework to give us a clear understanding of the principles behind and how it has shaped current youth justice strategies. The Child First framework was formed by integrating different philosophies within youth justice that focused on diversion and prevention. I will run you through a timeline that provides an overview on how the Child First framework was developed up to the point when the YJB identified it as the guiding principle for youth justice. If we need to pinpoint an initial moment when the concept was introduced, it would be by Haynes and Drakeford in 1998 in their book Young People and Youth Justice, where it is defined as a philosophy focused on diversion and minimum custody. Their approach was later formalized in 2004 through the All Wales Youth Offending Strategy. This strategy, for those of you who might not have heard of it, was developed by the Welsh Assembly Government, the Youth Justice Board, and local agencies. It emphasized a holistic and a prevention-focused approach to youth justice. It aimed to ensure that young people receive the services they're entitled to, while also addressing their specific individual needs. More than 10 years later, in 2015, academics Case and Haynes published the Positive Youth Justice Children First, Offender Second. The Children First, Offender Second principle has prevention of offending and other problematic behaviors by children as its central tenet, and it's founded on the belief that children are part of that solution, not part of the problem. By 2019, the tenets as we know them today were adopted. They were a combination of those principles outlined in the Positive Youth Justice model and the Constructive Resettlement model by Bateman and Hazel. The YJB and all the evidence gathered for more than 20 years turned the Child First concept into a practical framework that guides practitioners on how to support children in youth justice services. In order to do that, the YJB produced documents and guidance to support how the framework is implemented through different tools. Just to give you an example, the YJB has developed a self-assessment tool that supports youth justice services and partners to reflect on their application of the framework. The YJB has served as the main institution that disseminates best practice and research on the Child First framework and its tenets. For example, they founded the Child First Pathfinder project that highlights new approaches used by several youth justice services when applying the Child First tenets. You will be able to find references to these Pathfinders throughout our report. It's important to know that research has also played an important role in building the evidence base around the framework, which involves information on how the framework is applied and the positive impact it has on practitioners and children. As we might know, the Child First framework has 4 core tenets. The first one, seeing children as children, prioritizes the unique needs of children, their rights, capacities, and interests. To do so, the work around this tenet is developmentally informed and acknowledges the structural barriers that children face. The second one, building for social identity, focuses on recognizing children's individual strengths and capacities, leading to safer communities and fewer victims. One key element of the pro-social identity tenet is that all the work is constructive and future-oriented, build on supportive relationships that empower children to fulfill their potential and make positive contributions to society. The third one, collaborating with children, encourages meaningful participation and engagement with children to promote wider inclusion. However, the tenet also considers the important inclusion of carers, and as such, also pushes for their meaningful participation. Finally, but not least important, the diverting from stigma tenet minimizes the contact with the criminal justice through preemptive prevention, diversion, and minimal intervention. All the work aligned to this tenet seeks to minimize criminogenic stigma from contact with the system. Enough from me. I'm now going to hand over to my colleague Jess to start us on the overview of the research findings and the recommendations for the YJB.
Thank you very much, Fernanda. So, children's perspectives are very important to understanding how effectively youth justice services are meeting children's needs and enabling better outcomes as well. Our survey for children didn't explicitly use terminology from the Child First framework. So, for example, it didn't use the language of the 4 tenets that Fernanda's just talked through, but instead it explored how children felt and experienced the support, the processes, relationships, and interactions at their youth justice service. And the survey was designed to capture quantitative insight on their feelings, experiences, and emotions while at the service by asking children to indicate to what extent they agreed or disagreed with a series of statements that relate to the Child First tenets. We triangulated this insight with the perspectives of practitioners to understand how effectively youth justice services are able to currently apply the 4 tenets of the Child First framework in their work and identify some of the challenges as well that services might be facing. So we'll take each of the tenets, in turn to begin with. So thinking about as children, and as a reminder, this tenet is about seeing children as children, prioritizing the unique needs of children, their rights, capacities, and interests. Based on the survey findings, children felt their experiences and capabilities were recognized, suggesting that practitioners made active efforts to understand and consider their individual circumstances. 91% of children agreed that adults in the Youth Justice Service try to understand their life and background, and the same proportion agreed that adults in the Youth Justice Service listen to them. So this indicates that children felt practitioners were actively making an effort to understand and consider their individual experiences. Relatedly, 89% agreed that they'd been given chances to talk about what's happened in their life. This indicates that practitioners are creating space for children to share significant aspects of their lives and backgrounds, which aligns with the As Children tenet, which emphasizes the importance of practitioners understanding each child's individual circumstances to tailor interventions that address their specific needs. These findings aligned with practitioners' perspectives as well. So in our practitioners survey, the majority of practitioners, 92%, agreed that out-of-court interventions are tailored to children's needs and vulnerabilities. Additionally, practitioners highlighted the importance of ensuring that children understand what to expect in different settings. And the quote on the slide emphasizes this really well. It's from a case manager, and they said, "For me, it's reminding ourselves that yes, the offending might be serious, but they are children. I think it's about taking a more nurturing approach towards their behaviours and understanding the complexity of the issues." The building pro-social identity tenet is about promoting each child's capacities and strengths to foster a pro-social identity in the community. Additionally, the tenet is aimed at building supportive relationships that empower children to make contributions to society. Most children, 95%, said that they felt supported by adults at their youth justice service, and 79% agreed that the caseworker has helped them to solve problems in their life as well. This finding is echoed in feedback from practitioners who recognise the importance of fostering pro-social identity through tailored, strength-based approaches. In our survey, almost all practitioners, 95%, felt that their youth justice service supports children to build a pro-social identity as part of their plan, with 88% of practitioners agreeing that out-of-court interventions at their service are tailored to promote positive behaviours and pro-social identity in the community. During engagement with practitioners, they highlighted strength-based work as key to this, as well as community engagement and activities. Again, well demonstrated by the quote on the slide. I think there's a lot more focus on building strengths and promoting regular typical behaviours for the children, having activities that they do outside of school and things to keep them busy and promote positive pro-social identity. An important element of building pro-social identity is establishing supportive relationships in the community. In our survey, a slightly lower proportion, 60% of children, reported feeling part of their community, while 29% neither agreed nor disagreed that they felt part of their community. Now, there's no baseline that we could access for this data, which might well be consistent with the perspectives of children more widely than the youth justice context. However, it does suggest that while a majority of children in youth justice services do feel connected, there might be opportunities to strengthen the sense of community for those who were less certain, that 29%. Given the importance of community connection, further actions can be taken to understand what community can mean for children and also where youth justice services fit within that context as well. The Collaborating with Children tenet focuses on encouraging children's active participation while also fostering engagement and wider social inclusion. From our survey, 91% of children reported that their caseworker involved them in planning their time at the Youth Justice Service, and the same proportion, 91%, said that their caseworker asked them what they're interested in and tried to include those things in their plan as well. While still a majority, a slightly smaller proportion, so 71%, said that they'd been given the opportunity to do things that interest them at their time at the Youth Justice Service. So these results suggest that while children had been involved in assessments and planning, there might have been barriers to fully implementing children's interests as part of their plan. And that potential gap between children being involved in planning and actually being given the opportunity to explore interests reflects a distinction that's been highlighted in research previously, including by Case and Browning, who differentiate between participation, so children being involved in processes like attending meetings, and engagement, which involves forming positive relationships and feeling committed to processes. And that work emphasises the importance of moving beyond surface level involvement to foster more genuine relational engagement in youth justice practice. Practitioners demonstrated a good understanding of involving children in assessments and planning. However, some practitioners did point to barriers to effectively involving children at that more strategic level and ensuring that their voices are heard at a service level. So one manager expressed concern that collaboration with children that focused on strategic decision-making could be tokenistic when conducted without sufficient planning or expertise, or when those formal structures for participation and collaboration don't exist. There's definitely appetite across services for more support and information from the YJB on how to meaningfully engage and collaborate with children. And this support could build on participatory models for engagement. One of the services engaged for the research also acknowledged that the lack of a dedicated physical space for children to use could impact their ability to effectively collaborate and encourage participation as well. And that's why factors including space, but also time and available resources to engage, collaborate and support children effectively are really important environmental factors for the YJB to consider and account for when sharing information and guidance around the application of the Child First framework. And then finally, to think about the diverting from stigma tenet, which, just to remind you, is about minimising criminogenic stigma from contact with the youth justice system. It includes prevention and diversion work to prevent escalation into the formal youth justice system and the associated stigma. Practitioners emphasise the importance of having an awareness of a child's background to reduce the risk of reinforcing stigma, and described the importance of adopting an advocacy-based approach to divert children from the formal criminal justice system as well. Our survey results show that 84% of youth justice service managers agreed that the approach taken at their service minimises the potential harm caused to children through contact with the criminal justice system, in line with the Child First framework. Creating a non-judgmental, supportive environment is an important element of the diverting from stigma tenet because it can help to reduce the negative impacts of stigma. Our survey results suggest that the majority of children, 74%, did not feel judged by adults in their youth justice service. And these findings suggest that children perceive an environment where they are understood and supported, helping to reduce stigma. Another important element of this tenet, though, is preventing long-term negative consequences and instead promoting developmental pathways. In our survey, we asked children about their perceptions of their future. 74% of children reported feeling positive about their future, with 21% neither agreeing nor disagreeing whether they felt positive. When asked about future plans, a slightly smaller proportion, 70% of children, had planned what they would like to do in the future, and 12% said that they hadn't made plans for what they would like to do. However, almost all children, 91%, said that their caseworker had encouraged them to think about future plans and their hopes, with 81% saying their caseworker had helped them to work out what they're good at. So these findings taken together suggest that caseworkers are playing an active role in fostering a forward-thinking mindset, while the uncertainty and lack of planning expressed by roughly a fifth of children could reflect the typical doubts and uncertainties that many children experience about the future. It also indicates an area where youth justice services should continue to focus resource and support in line with the Child First framework. So based on these findings, we made the following recommendations in our research. So we recommended that the YJB should continue to identify and disseminate good practice online around the application of the Child First tenets, including via the Resource Hub, the YJB Bulletin, social media, to support youth justice services to understand how to apply the tenets in context, and as shareable resources to improve parental understanding of interventions to boost confidence and engagement. And detailed related recommendations can be found in our report if you're interested to dig into that a little deeper, recommendations 1, 2, and 5. The YJB should disseminate information to practitioners, reflecting our research finding that the proportion of children who report feeling part of their community is not as high as the proportion who report positively about other protective factors. The YJB guidance for management boards should cover the need to involve other agencies who may be better positioned to foster a sense of community. So thinking about how to bring in partners and community-based organisations, including sports or arts clubs. A further recommendation we made is that services should communicate to children how their feedback is being used. So as part of achieving collaborative working with children to strengthen collaboration and provide clarity on how their feedback has been acted upon, the YJB should encourage services to continue to seek feedback from children regularly and use a child-friendly "you said, we did" template to reflect back to children where their feedback has shaped service delivery. And then finally, in response to our survey findings around a fifth of children express uncertainty or a lack of planning around their future, youth justice services should review how the children they support are engaged in conversations about future planning to understand how children's perceptions might be influenced by external factors or concerns, such as limited access to education or employment opportunities, and then how practitioners and partners might be able to provide additional support. Over to you, Fernanda.
As we mentioned earlier in the presentation, a critical aim of the research was to explore practitioners' understanding and awareness of the Child First framework. We found that practitioners showed high levels of awareness of the framework and understanding of the tenet. For instance, during our engagement, an intervention worker told us that for them, Child First involved the treatment of children as children, the diversion from stigma through prevention, and working with them to help them stay out of trouble. While there were high levels of understanding and awareness, we also found that practitioners need more clarity and reassurance around the framework, specifically about the practicalities of the framework and how it coexists with other approaches like trauma-informed and restorative justice. As Jess mentioned, the Venn diagram was a key facilitator for us to be able to open the discussion with practitioners and understand more clearly where practitioners
Hi everyone. Sorry about that. We are just had a Wi-Fi turned down, so let me just share my screen again, see if this works. There we go. Right, Fernanda, is that coming up for you?
Yes, it is.
Lovely. Danny?
Use my number.
Perfect. I think we all can see the slides now. So I'm just going to pick up where we were around what our deep dives revealed in how the tenets of Child First were communicated and embedded at a service level. In one of the youth justice services, the management team proactively shared literature and information about the Child First tenets in different formats. That includes podcasts, social media, and webinars. Despite these, managers reported a resistance from some practitioners to embracing the language and materials of the Child First framework, and possibly some anxiety brought on by a perceived shift in culture. The second service, engaged via our deep dive, reported a good familiarity with trauma-informed practice and understood the introduction and application of the Child First tenets as closely aligned with this way of working. As such, practitioners reported less anxiety about a shift to a new framework or terminology and were more comfortable considering the Child First framework as an extension of a well-embedded trauma-informed approach. Considering the experience of both services, it appears that explicitly connecting and relating the Child First framework with practice that is familiar to practitioners, such as trauma-informed practice in this case, can reduce anxiety about a shift in ways of working or new terminology. When embedding the Child First tenet, services should look to emphasize Child First as a framework for evidence-based practice, which will draw on and consolidate existing practice that is familiar to practitioners. Hopefully you can see the next slide now. The use of resources produced by the YJB and other organizations and authors is also something that we explored during all the phases of our research. Overall, we found that practitioners had positive views of the resources available around the Child First framework. However, each role, that is, managers, youth justice service practitioners, and statutory partners, use them differently. For example, during our survey, 75% of managers use the national standards compared to 51% of youth justice practitioners and statutory partners. A similar disparity can be seen in the proportion of managers who use the YJB case management guidance, where 93% of managers use them compared to 67% of youth justice practitioners and statutory partners. Despite these variants in which frontline practitioners, statutory partners, and managers use these materials, all roles have similar perspective on the quality and relevance of this guidance. While there were varying reasons for this disparity in the use of resources, results from our qualitative engagement found that as practitioners become more experienced and the way of working is more embedded into practice, then the reliance on the documents decreases. Relatedly, practitioners identify areas to improve existing guidance materials related to the Child First framework to ensure their applicability across a range of contexts and settings. First, practitioners highlighted that the materials often do not fully explore the nuances of each individual context and case. As a result, in some instances, the guidance can feel overly optimistic about what practitioners can realistically achieve. As one practitioner described it, often the guidance says that if we do this or do that, then we can change a person, and you can always do that. Secondly, practitioners mentioned that while the guidance provides clear application advice for some youth justice settings, there is less clarity in others. For example, practitioners noted that the guidance on applying the framework in secure settings was less clear compared to out-of-court context or work in the community. This inconsistency in clarity may be reflected in practitioners' confidence levels, where 92% of practitioners felt confident applying the tenets in community settings. However, only 60% felt confident applying them in secure settings. This suggests a need for more detailed, context-specific guidance to support practitioners working in more complex or restrictive environments. We also explored practitioners' and managers' preferences regarding the types of materials and sources of information they use. Practitioners shared that they actively use YJB resources to deepen their understanding of the Child First framework. They particularly value formats like podcasts and visual materials, which they describe as being clear and more accessible than traditional written documents. As one practitioner put it, podcasts and visual things are more interesting and engagement than a document to read. The infographic on the Child First tenets, which you can see on the right-hand side of your screens, was especially praised for its clarity and ease of understanding. Many practitioners also highlighted that podcasts were especially helpful as they could be easily integrated into daily routines, such as while commuting or working on other tasks. In addition, practitioners reflected on the potential of platforms like LinkedIn to disseminate information about the Child First framework to a wide range of audiences, including those who may not directly work in youth justice, but have an interest in the sector. Despite most practitioners welcome information in different formats, managers at both services suggested that the volume of information available to staff across different platforms and forums could at times be overwhelming and even cause some confusion about which information sources should be used. This feedback underlines the importance of using diverse modern communication channels to make guidance more engaging, accessible, and widely shared. Additionally, the YJB can further support managers to effectively prioritize how information on the Child First framework is disseminated across their services by collating information and providing clear steers on key messaging to avoid any confusion. Training is important when talking about the implementation of the framework. In our survey, 62% of practitioners agree with that, and they felt that good quality training had been an enabler when implementing the Child First framework. This reaffirms that training isn't just a box-ticking exercise, but rather fundamental to building confidence and understanding among practitioners. During our workshops, we explored different types of learning approaches, and practitioners emphasized that discussion-based training was the most impactful. This approach allows staff to actively engage, ask questions, and consider how the framework applies specifically to their day-to-day and individual cases. Beyond simply learning the theory, discussion-based training supports critical thinking and encourages reflective practice, as one of the practitioners mentioned. The Youth Justice Board plays a critical role in disseminating resources that practitioners rely on to implement the Child First framework effectively. Through the YJB established channels, a wide range of practitioners, as well as academics, can access the most up-to-date information, supporting consistency and shared understanding across the sector. In this context, we have two key recommendations that align with the YJB's role. The first recommendation is to disseminate the application of the framework tenets across different settings. As such, the YJB should review the Research Hub submissions and practice examples to ensure that they reflect what the application of the child tenants looks like across the different settings and capture more challenging contexts to support practitioners managing these situations. If this resonates with your experience or interest, I encourage you to look at recommendations 7, 9, and 10 in the report, which go into this in more detail. The second recommendation is to disseminate how the framework aligns with other ways of working. Practitioners highlighted the need to understand how the Child First framework connects with and builds on existing approaches, such as the trauma-informed practice or restorative justice. To consolidate practitioners' understanding of Child First as an evidence-based practice framework that incorporates other approaches, the YJB should continue to share practical resources to demonstrate how the Child First framework is aligned with other more familiar ways of working. For more information on this point, I recommend referring to recommendation 8 in the report. We also have further recommendations that build on what we have discussed so far and reflect the finding from our work with practitioners. Firstly, we recommend that the YJB should continue to ensure that resources shared with services are in diverse formats. This includes podcasts and other visual content. Using diverse formats helps reach a wider audience and makes the information more engaging and easier to absorb, particularly for practitioners who may prefer more interactive and visual learning styles. Secondly, and closely aligned to the earlier recommendations that I mentioned, to avoid any confusion and overwhelm, we suggest that the YJB collates information and messaging about the Child First framework to provide clear guidance on how services can prioritize and sequence information they receive. You can find further information in recommendation 12 and 13 in this report. Finally, at a local service level, we recommend that services consider holding discussion-based sessions to review guidance and information on the Child First framework, to give practitioners the space and opportunity to ask questions, share experiences, and feel confident in the application of the framework. As always, if you'd like to explore these recommendations in more detail, please refer to recommendation 14 in the report. I'm going to hand over back to Jess.
Thank you. And we're going to just attempt a small tech shuffle round. So if you go off on mute now.
Yes.
And I will. And I'm just going to reshare my screen if that's okay. Brilliant. Thanks everyone. It wouldn't be an online webinar if there wasn't a technical issue. Thank you very much for bearing with us. Brilliant. Hopefully everyone can see the slides again now. Yep. Fantastic. So across qualitative engagement, a consistent theme was the impact and influence of partners, including police, probation, education, and social care, on how effectively youth justice services are able to apply the Child First framework. And we found that strong relationships with partners have the potential to drive a more holistic approach to working with children. Practitioners emphasised the importance of multi-agency collaboration in youth justice when working with children as well. And some youth justice services mentioned that good working relationships with local magistrates, judges, and police officers have supported partners to make child-centred decisions. The quotes on the slide highlight some of the positive elements and impact some of the strong partnerships. So you can see the quote at the beginning. I'll just read that out. With us being a partnership, we've got access to people in education, health, and the police. When we're looking at why these children are doing what they're doing, there's a lot of vulnerabilities and things underpinning that, and it means that we can address that earlier on. So there, the value of partnerships in supporting prevention and diversion work is really key. And the second quote there's very much been an open door with the courts for us to make improvements, and we get a lot of good feedback from courts as well, from magistrates and district judges about where they've made decisions based on what we've been able to tell them about the child. So in that case, the partnership has fostered kind of an openness from partners and a collaborative way of working to support a child to get better outcomes. Practitioners also mentioned the benefits of having seconded staff from partner organisations such as police or probation, health, at their service. And this co-location has allowed for great appreciation of ways of working and also facilitated partners' understanding of the Child First framework. However, partners' use of different language and terminology, due in large part to different strategic priorities, was seen as a barrier to applying the Child First framework. And in fact, in our survey with practitioners, 60% of youth justice practitioners said that the language and terminology used by key partners is a barrier to the implementation of the Child First framework. Additionally, practitioners suggested that differences in terminology are linked more broadly to different strategic priorities and the approach that different organisations or agencies take to youth justice. For example, the police approach to managing risk might, in some cases, practitioners felt misaligned with the Child First framework and its tenets. And a quote from a case manager evidences this, referencing inaccessible language used in the court environment. They said, sometimes even the language that is spoken in court by judges, even me as an adult, I don't understand it. So you can imagine for young people, they're sitting there, they're using these big words. So there have been times when I've had to intervene because the young person might not understand what they're saying. So a point around inaccessibility and kind of misaligning with the Child First framework approach of treating children as children. This was reiterated by some seconded staff engaged for the research as well, including recognition of different strategic priorities across partners. For example, a police officer who we spoke to, who was at the time seconded to a youth justice service, said, I think from a police point of view, we've always come from the fact of enforcement, where the Child First approach is very much prevention and intervention. So a more fundamental difference in how you're approaching youth justice are between partners, which practitioners identified as a barrier to working collaboratively across partners to apply the framework. In terms of recommendations, we made the following in our research report. So related to disseminating good practice examples, the YJB has a really important role to play in supporting services to demonstrate the broad alignment of the Child First framework with partners' own strategic priorities. The YJB could circulate resources that can be shared with partners, demonstrating the application of the Child First tenets in different contexts as part of a conversation about how partners can work together to get better outcomes. There's also an important recommendation about fostering collaborative reflection with partners. So there's an opportunity for the YJB to build on the successful rollout of the Child First self-assessment toolkit to bring partners together to reflect on common themes and gaps in how they currently understand and apply the Child First framework and collaboratively identify solutions. And then sitting at a more strategic level, the YJB can continue to meet with national and regional representatives of key partner agencies to consolidate and reinforce the positive conversations that are happening between partners on the ground. And then finally, I just wanted to share with you some areas that we identified in our research for further research and inquiry to continue to build the evidence base on the application of the Child First framework. And these include research around children's understanding on what solving problems means and how this aligns with youth justice service interventions. So our survey with children found that a slightly lower proportion, 79% of children, agreed that their caseworker has helped them to solve problems in their life compared to other statements asked in the survey, with 50% strongly agreeing with that statement, but 29% slightly agreeing with that statement. And while this still represents a substantial level of positive engagement, it highlights an area worth exploring further, particularly because it raises questions about what solving problems actually means from the perspective of children and how this aligns with the scope of support that youth justice services can provide. Exploring these perceptions could offer really valuable insight into how practitioners might more effectively support children or how youth justice services can work in partnership to address wider issues that might be impacting children's lives. We also identified a further area for research around parents and carers' views on their children's involvement with youth justice services. So actually in the survey for children, 87% of children said that their parents or carers understood what they were doing in the youth justice service, which highlights that children's experience is that parents or carers are generally informed or engaged. However, we know from evidence from a number of sources, including Hampson, Nisbet and Case, suggests that parents' relationship with youth justice services can sometimes be fraught, with some parents disengaged in their child's path, with other parents possibly distrusting the system itself. And as such, more research is needed to explore parents' own perspectives. So understand the impact that youth justice service interventions have for them and families, and ensure that they understand interventions that their children are receiving. And finally, further research could look at how diversion and out-of-court approaches impact children in the youth justice system and their outcomes. So we know there's a data gap around outcomes for children who receive diversion interventions and out-of-court disposals. And while our practitioner survey found high levels of confidence in applying the Child First framework in out-of-court work, more research is needed to understand how this work is experienced by children and also how it impacts outcomes for children. So just to kind of draw us to the end of the presentation, it's really important to recognise that research which involves and affects children is accessible to children. We've created accessible and engaging summary reports to support children, families and practitioners to engage with our research findings. So you can see these on the right-hand side of the screen. There's 4 summary reports in total, and each one is focused around a different tenet from the Child First framework. They use visual shapes and guided questions to lead children, families and practitioners through the content in a way that follows the natural kind of thought process to digest and make sense of that information. And we really hope that the summary reports will encourage reflection and discussion. They're designed to help show children who contributed to the research as well that their insight has made a difference, and show them how that's been interpreted and taken forward. And you can find and download these summary reports as well as the main research report in PDF and accessible format on the gov.uk website, which is linked to the bottom, and hopefully we can send that link around as well when we circulate materials after the webinar today.
Wonderful. Fantastic. Thank you very much, Jess. Thank you very much, Fernanda. And thank you for everyone for bearing with us through our Wi-Fi breakdown. So, you've heard lots of bits and pieces and lots of nuggets, and we can see some questions have come through already. I just wanted to close by kind of reminding everyone of the overarching finding, which is that we have found significant awareness and understanding of the Child First decision-making framework amongst youth justice service practitioners, really high levels of confidence in the application of the 4 tenets. And really the most important thing, and what we are really excited to be able to share, is that a majority of children reported feeling supported, understood and listened to by adults in the youth justice service. Obviously, as we said, there are some settings where this feels easier to apply than others, and there are always ways to tweak and make things better. Yeah, overall, a really positive story to tell. Right, so moving us on, I'm absolutely amazed. We have an extra 5 minutes for our Q&A. So for those of you who have questions, thoughts, reflections, please pop them in the Q&A function. We will be able to see them in a minute. And also, at the same time, there is a QR code right now on the screen with a link underneath. If you're able to scan that, there is a very short survey to try and understand whether this format worked for you, whether this workshop and webinar was helpful, interesting, what could be done. So really grateful if you want to send a bit of your information back to the YJB around this webinar. Fabulous. I'll give everyone a second to pop a question in the Q&A and also look at that survey. Lovely. All right, I'm going to scroll to our first questions. So the way I'm going to be facilitating these, I'll be bringing in my colleagues Jess and Fernanda to answer with a little bit more detail. And my colleague Danny, just wave at me if something is not going right, please. Lovely. So the first one that's come in was, that's really interesting about people's identity with their community. I think young people's concept of community and their understanding of their place within that community is a really important part of the work. It's also helpful for practitioners to think about community identification, particularly when we're working with young people who live in communities where offending, antisocial behaviour and adversity are more prevalent. We absolutely agree with that. The question, I suppose, is how can services work with other agencies or presence in the community to foster a sense of belonging, build pro-social identity. We also know that children's identities might be very strongly tied to their communities online, which are not necessarily geographically based. I'm just going to see if, Jess, you have anything to add to that.
Not a huge amount, but just to reflect that it's a really important question. And I think it's tricky, isn't it? In community, it's a really complex and complicated thing, and a very important thing for children for different reasons. So understanding more and digging in more, kind of as we found in our work about what community actually means for children, kind of mapping that out, understanding networks, understanding positive influences, the push and pull factors, I think is a really important part of working with a child to build pro-social identity. I know there's a lot of really positive work in this space which looks at that. And I would say our research sort of was tip of the iceberg there in understanding that finding. So yeah, a really interesting reflection, and I think something for kind of renewed focus on as we go forward.
Lovely.
Thank you.
Fantastic, thank you. We have a second question that's come through, which was about whether we could share the questions we asked children so that youth justice services could use them to understand how well embedded Child First is locally. We wouldn't share the exact research tools, but the methods are in the report. So if you want to download the report, you'll have quite a lot of detail in there on what the survey responses were like, and therefore some of the questions in there will be, you'll be able to see them as well.
Yeah, and I would just add to that, I mean, really positive to hear that kind of people are interested in taking elements of the research and applying it to kind of your local service to get that feedback kind of from your service, from practitioners and from children as well. So as Kalyan said, probably the research tools we use for this specific work might not be, in fact, kind of the best questions for you to be asking in your local context. But if you do take a look through the research and kind of pull out some of the key approaches that we took in the methods, it might be that you can kind of draft a set of questions that kind of align best with your service and allow you to probe a little deeper to understand that as well. I would also point you to the Child First self-assessment tool, which is something developed by the YJB, and I know is kind of designed to help services understand kind of where they are in the journey of embedding and implementing Child First.
Lovely, thank you, Jess. Fantastic. Third question. Do we have any thoughts around the application of the Child First framework to wider youth justice partners, say youth custody? Yes, we do. Did our survey distinguish between different levels of connection and support between children and youth justice services? For example, children engaged by community order versus custody. So really interesting question, really important, because obviously the children that are worked with will come into contact with a variety of practitioners and settings. We certainly did find less confidence in applying that setting in the youth custody setting than in the out of court or the community sector. There are also challenges that were related to the environment, but there was also reflection and discussion amongst practitioners about how there might be ways to share guidance or information to people who work in other sectors are more enforcement focused, like policing or custody, that could help translate what Child First might mean in that sector. Jess, would you like to come in on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's exactly right. It was raised consistently throughout our engagement as a major challenge, and our survey data reflects that as well in terms of practitioners' level of confidence across different settings. There's really high levels of confidence applying the Child First framework in the community, in out of courts work. When you get to custody, that drops right down, and practitioners obviously expressing that a big part of that is access and the environment, which it kind of in many ways is not aligned to a Child First framework and the tenets of the Child First framework. So certainly an area where there's more to do to understand how the framework can be brought to align and kind of support custodial settings to align with that framework to support better outcomes for children and the community as well. Just another point from that question, which was around any differences we identified for children engaged via community order and custody. I think the main thing that comes to mind there, and it's probably kind of very familiar to everyone on this call, but practitioners also raised challenges on the other end of the spectrum of working with children who are on very short orders. So where you don't have a lot of time to work with a child on a short order, kind of a community order around diversion, for example, And what that means for applying the Child First framework, kind of building relationships, doing some of that strength-based work. And that's why our recommendation to the YJB related to this is to kind of review the guidance around Child First and make sure that it kind of can take account and consider those more challenging contexts and settings and environments, just to demonstrate to services kind of how the framework can be used across practice, across those different settings. But a really important question.
Thanks, Jess. And for completion, part of the question was whether our survey distinguished when our survey was addressed to children around what environments they were engaging with, and I think the answer is no.
Yes, it didn't. So our survey asked some basic demographic questions to help us understand kind of the broad cohort that we were engaging, but because we highlighted the low sample as well, and to protect the anonymity for an ethical approach in the work, we didn't go into detail or ask children anything about the offence or kind of the order that they were on, just to keep the questions really focused on the support they received rather than kind of anything personal about why they were with the service.
Yeah, exactly. That was part of our minimising risk and ethical approach. Lovely, fantastic. Next question was, what did we think contributed to the inconsistent use of the different guidance materials, length, format? Did we come across any innovative ways of implementing guidance through other work in the youth justice sector or the public service? Fernanda, do you want to take that one? You've started an answer.
I think maybe related to the second question, and is about referring you all to the Pathfinder's report, that they do show innovative ways, like the sample Pathfinder, around the use of art to implement the collaboration with children tenant. Jess, I don't know if you have anything else to add.
Yeah, so we did look in a bit more detail and would encourage you to take a look at the report, because there were some interesting findings around use of guidance, kind of more detailed than we were able to share in the presentation, around how clear people found the guidance was, whether they felt it was up to date as well, and whether they refer to it regularly in their role. For me, one of the interesting things that stood out around the guidance material, which I think we did touch on, is the difference between how frontline practitioners and managers engage with particularly the national standards and the case management guidance. So in both cases, for both the national standards and the case management guidance, managers at youth justice services reported using them a lot more than frontline practitioners. So I think something just to consider and think about in terms of how that guidance is pitched, kind of where and to which roles they might be most relevant, and how they're used sort of in day to day. I think another important point, which Fernanda, I believe, kind of touched on in her presentation, was kind of confidence levels of practitioners improving as they become familiar with processes and ways of working, and kind of needing to rely less on the guidance as they become more comfortable and confident in their work, which is of course a positive thing. I would also mention we did ask about other sources of information and guidance that we didn't kind of get time to cover in the presentation, including guidance internal and produced by that youth justice service, academic sources as well, and people did report using these to support the application of the Child First framework, albeit to a lesser extent than the national standards and the case management guidance. But it does paint a picture of practitioners drawing on different sources of information when they're working with children and thinking about how to apply the Child First framework.
Yeah.
And just to build on that as well, practitioners did mention that they rely a lot on their managers and speaking to them. So that's also some area of opportunity for the YJB to continue to work very closely with managers. That's also one of the recommendations that we have in the report. The other kind of factor that might have also contributed that practitioners did mention was the time that they had. They had very busy caseloads, so sometimes they don't have the time necessarily to go back into the document. So that's why the diverse formats would be something helpful for them to use more consistently throughout their days.
Yeah, and people did mention podcasts, infographics, very helpful. And as you say, being able to ask your manager a precise question and having the full answer was found to be really helpful. Wonderful. Thank you. Next question was, anything on the potential of AI or other tech? This is the question on everyone's lips at the moment, isn't it? This was not something that was included in the research at that point of design. However, given the current climate, of course, it's something that should be considered going forward. And obviously, it should also be mentioned as part of the safeguarding and kind of data safety issues as well. But cannot really provide much more in here at this point. Next question is, I'm interested in how the principles were applied in practice to risk management. Was there any feedback on this from practitioners? This is a really good question because this was perhaps one of the sources of conversation and kind of constructive debate and sometimes perceived tension between a risk-based approach and a child-first based approach. And there was sometimes a perception that the need to consider risk could be at odds with being child first. I think I'm going to bring Jess in because you ran one of the workshops where this was quite an interesting topic of conversation.
Yeah, of course. I'd say the practitioners that we were speaking to working in youth justice services were very skilled and very comfortable in navigating this, and probably their perception was that for community or for partners even, the conflict between risk management and the child first framework was the greater concern than themselves kind of struggling to reconcile those two things. From their perspective and kind of from the perspective of the literature, the child first framework, which is an evidence-based way of working to support children in youth justice, kind of allows for risk management within that, in that it's evidence-based and the focus is on improving outcomes for children, the community and victims as well. But that's not to say that there's not still kind of wider concerns about how the two align. And I think the kind of important thing to pull out here is how to communicate that to partners and parents as well. I think parents and carers are really important kind of part of the conversation to make sure that there's clarity on how the child first framework does allow for risk management, does protect communities, victims and children as well, as part of communicating what it's all about.
Lovely. Thanks, Jess. Next question is, what can we do to support our police colleagues to understand child first principles? Because I think they find it hard on our service that it's not about punishment. There's a few points here that my colleagues have put that I'll come to in a second. But I did want to say that one of the people that we spoke with was someone who was on secondment from the police in a youth justice service. And it was very interesting because I think essentially nothing replaces lived experience, and the conversations with them and colleagues who were in similar positions with them essentially showed that they were able to better understand what child first actually meant, and take away lessons as to what that might mean for them in their day-to-day. So a couple of other points here. It would be really important to help reframe the narrative. The child first framework is not about being lenient. It's more about, as Jess just said, being evidence-based, and the fact that it focuses on outcomes is about reducing reoffending through constructive engagement. So it perhaps focusing on long-term aligned objectives can help. The second one is about actually producing perhaps some robust evidence, so lower reoffending rates, improved well-being, providing some case studies that emphasize the impact of children can also shift perceptions. I think that's part of our recommendation 15 in the report. Does Fernanda or Jess, do you want to come in on this?
I think you cover mainly the main points there. There is evidence. As I mentioned, part of the history of child first has been built on that evidence. So it's just about presenting and digesting that robust evidence that shows what the impact this has in children and practitioners. And I think we referred to it thoroughly throughout the report. Jess, I don't know if you have anything else to add.
No, nothing else. Thanks, Fernanda.
Lovely, thank you. Next question is, lovely. How do other youth justice services navigate the need for completion of assessments such as the PDATs versus the child first approach and a rapport building at the start of engagement? And I'm going to throw that one directly to Jess.
Yes, so we're talking about the prevention diversion assessment tool here. So kind of just understanding that the question here is about how to balance kind of a child first approach with some of the processes, I imagine, kind of that are necessary at the beginning of working with a child, at the same time that you're trying to build a rapport and kind of that relational approach. And assessments did come up in our engagement with practitioners and kind of how to use them as a framework to start those conversations with children and work around them. It didn't come up as a major barrier in our research to building rapport with children. So we'd be interested if people do have more reflections on that and whether it is a barrier in your experience. We'd be interested if people do want to pop that in the Q&A, kind of just for broader understanding. But you can see from the survey results that practitioners broadly felt confident in completing assessments in a way that involved children, which is, of course, a really important part of applying the Child First framework, and those tenets around collaboration and as children. So recognising children's individual strengths as a key part of an assessment of need and understanding kind of the whole world of that child.
Lovely, thanks, Jess. I'm going to move on to the next one. Fabulous. So, how do the Child First tenets align with other frameworks that support the involvement, engagement, and participation of children and young people? Many national organisations working alongside youth justice partners have developed their own frameworks, which can sometimes lead to overlapping efforts. This presents a challenge. Children, young people, and their families may experience survey fatigue, become disengaged from participation activities. And I'm going to add to that question, another impact of this might be a different language that might trying to get to the same thing. So this is really interesting. Part of the conversations that we had along the way was speaking with practitioners about how they felt different frameworks or approaches overlapped. And it was really fascinating because my colleagues will correct me if I didn't get this quite right, but I think fundamentally a lot of the approaches were aiming to do the same thing. Sometimes people might name things different ways, but actually we found when we did some exercises that the approaches were really interconnected. There was a lot of overlap, as you said, and having practitioners have a really kind of fundamental conversation about what they're trying to do together can help that connection and alignment flow throughout their activities with children further down the line. Jess or Fernanda, do you want to come in?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. As you said, it's about finding kind of a common thread across the frameworks and a language that partners can all relate to and kind of build behind. I think that's the aim of the Child First framework, as we found in the research, in keeping the language simple with the tenets and kind of focused on the evidence. Certainly, we found there were some challenges, kind of as we've highlighted, around overcomplicating the landscape and people kind of wanting clarity on how does Child First sit with this way we were already doing things, or this kind of other bit of information we have on how we should be working with children. And I think it's important that the messaging here is just really consistent on how the Child First framework kind of sits across this and supports practitioners to use the evidence and kind of apply an evidence-based way of working with the children that they support.
Super, thank you very much, Jess. Lovely. Next question, were there many practitioners discussing the Child First Effective Practice Certificate as a source of information? Is that something that came up?
Sorry, could you repeat that?
Yeah. Did practitioners discuss the Child First Effective Practice Certificate as a source of information? I think the answer is no.
No, so that hasn't come up in the work actually, but certainly something for us to take away and kind of consider as well. Yeah, apologies, I don't have much to add to that.
No, it's fine.
Thanks for raising it, but no, it didn't come up in the research.
Lovely. We have another question here, which is that we reflected that 92% of practitioners felt that out-of-court interventions are tailored to children's needs and vulnerabilities. Given that the Child First is a whole system approach, including diversion from stigma at all stages, were the children's different for post-court interventions? And I think by post-court, this is kind of children who have been to court.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. So I think kind of as we touched on already, confidence around the application of the framework certainly did drop off across settings, custodial and in court as well. So where children might be attending court with practitioners feeling less confident and less clear that they were able to apply different elements of the framework in those settings. Because our work focused on the experience and perceptions of youth justice service practitioners, so people working in youth justice services, we don't have the perspectives of practitioners who work in custody directly with children in custodial settings or kind of court officials either. So we are missing part of the picture there. But certainly from a youth justice service perspective, the levels of confidence around the application of the framework were lower.
Great, thanks, Jess. I just want to call out this question because I think it relates to the broader conversation, which is around how do we think a child first system can be truly child first when the criminal justice system was built and structured around adults, especially if partners are not on board, and think of it as a soft approach. I think this really relates to what we were just saying earlier, which is around killing partners with kindness, around information. So making sure that there's a lot of evidence that's shared, aligning on the long-term outcomes, and perhaps providing partners with kind of easy shortcuts about what child first might look like in their sector. But completely appreciate, and this is absolutely what we found, that the different contexts, particularly contexts that were created around adults in the first place, can be environments that are much more difficult to apply child first in. Wonderful. We have a question here, which is around being keen to do further work with the YJB and researchers on some of the data gaps regarding outcomes. Leah, do you want to come in on that? Who might be the best person to contact?
Yeah, that's no problem. So for further research with the YJB, the best protocol is to email our evidence and insights. Sorry, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yeah, best protocol would be to email our evidence and insights mailbox. So that's yjbinsights@justice.gov.uk. Just for ease, because I know it can be a bit difficult to remember these things, I'll pop it into the Q&A function, so you can be able to refer back to that. And then another question from us is, what are the YJB next steps? So internally, we've been having discussions around the recommendations, and they're being explored internally as well. And as they take shape, we intend to share the progress through channels such as the YJB Bulletin and other channels as well. But in terms of what we're doing at the moment, a lot of the recommendations, I think, feed quite nicely into our business as usual work. So we're using the Youth Justice Resource Hub to highlight practical examples, showing how services are supporting children's everyday lives, helping them to feel more connected to their communities, and working in partnership with local organisations. We're also continuing to promote ways that children can be more involved in shaping their own journeys, making sure their voices are heard and acted on. There's a real focus on planning positively for the future for children, tackling stigma and strengthening partnerships across courts, custody and beyond. We're making sure that the Child First framework aligns with other approaches such as trauma-informed and restorative practice, and that our guidance reflects the complexity of real-life situations. We're also improving how training and information is shared, offering podcasts, videos, and a space for peer learning through developing practice forums. And finally, we're committed to building the evidence base around what works, especially from children's and families' perspectives, to help shape future policy and practice. So, hopefully that answers that question there, but I will hand back to Kalyan from Crest.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Leah. Wonderful. I think that is the end of the questions that have come through. So thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much for these thoughtful questions. The ones that we don't have the answers to are really because they're ones that are about developing continuous practice, adjusting to different environments, and essentially building on the success that we found so far. I just want to say a word from the team, which is that we've thoroughly enjoyed working on this. It's such a joy, to be fair, to be working in the criminal justice system and to be working on things that work well, to see positive impact on children's lives. It kind of gives us the courage to keep going. So thank you to everyone who's done this work. Thank you to everyone who's engaged. As Jess was saying earlier, it's been 18 months of us thinking about this. We're really delighted that it's come to a report and the child-friendly, accessible versions. Please do reach out if you have any further questions, particularly if you've gone through the report and kind of spot something that you want to have a chat about. And thank you so much to the YJB for commissioning this and letting us have a conversation about it. Thank you very much. Leah, I'll hand back over to you.
Thanks, Kellyanne. Yeah, I just want to reiterate what was said there. It's been a pleasure to work with Crest on this project. And like I said at the beginning, we're really pleased to see this really important piece of research come to fruition. The report is published on gov.uk if you hadn't had a chance to look at it beforehand. And yeah, I just want to say thank you to all of you for taking time out of your, I'm sure, very busy work days to attend and listen to us talk about this piece of research and help to get the reach out further. So thank you very much. And yeah, we'll leave it there. Thanks, everyone.